He moved before anyone could scream. The training hall had gone quiet, the way rooms go quiet, right before something breaks. A young woman stood frozen at the center of the arena floor, her ice spell half-formed and trembling in the air above her palm. Her instructor advanced on her with his blade raised, and there was nothing playful in his eyes anymore. This was supposed to be a lesson. It had turned into something else. Students in the stands realized what was happening only seconds before it happened. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted her name. The professor's sword came down in a clean arc, meant to end far too close to flesh for any mock battle. It never landed. A blur crossed the arena floor faster than most of the watching students could track. A boy barely older than the freshmen around him caught the blade on his own weapon, absorbed the force of the strike without so much as a stumble, and turned the professor's momentum back against him in one smooth motion. The older man went sprawling. His sword clattered somewhere off to the side. The hall stayed silent for a long beat. Then it erupted. The professor scrambled up, furious and humiliated, and demanded to know who dared interfere. The boy didn't raise his voice. He simply told the man that a teacher who couldn't control his own temper had no business holding a blade near his students. Then he asked, calmly, whether the professor wanted to try that again, properly, this time, against someone who could actually fight back. The professor did try. It did not go well for him. Within moments, the fight was over, and the man who was supposed to be teaching swordsmanship to an entire class of freshmen was on his knees, disarmed, breathing hard, staring up at a first-year student who had just made him look like a child playing with a stick. Whispers spread through the stands immediately. Nobody in that room had ever seen a professor beaten that badly, let alone by someone who hadn't even finished his first year. Nobody in that room knew who they were really looking at. To understand how a boy that young became someone that dangerous, the story has to go back much further than the academy. It has to go back to the moment his life ended the first time. He had been a king once. Not in this world. In another one, an entire lifetime ago. In a body that no longer existed, and a kingdom that no longer remembered him the way he remembered it. He had ruled through wars and betrayals and long years of exhausting effort, and by the time death finally caught up to him, he had achieved almost everything a person could achieve. Power, territory, a name that would outlive him. He had also been, in ways he rarely let himself think about, completely alone. That loneliness would matter later. For now, all that mattered was that King Gray died, and something impossible happened next. Instead of nothing, instead of silence, there was a cry. Small, high-pitched, and unmistakably his own. He opened eyes that had never opened before and found himself staring up at unfamiliar faces, wrapped in unfamiliar cloth, inside a body with no strength in it at all. He was a baby, and judging by the wooden ceiling above him and the plain linen wrapped around his tiny limbs, whatever world he had landed in was nowhere close to the one he had ruled. His new parents named him Arthur. Alice held him like he was the only thing that had ever mattered to her, and Reynolds hovered nearby with the awkward, overjoyed energy of a first-time father who didn't quite know what to do with his hands. Arthur, still very much King Gray on the inside, found the whole situation almost insulting at first. He had commanded armies. Now he couldn't even hold up his own head. He assumed this new world was simple, primitive even, a step backward from everything he had known. He was wrong, and it didn't take long to find out. The first hint came from a conversation he wasn't supposed to understand yet, about something called mana, spoken so casually by the adults around him that he almost missed how strange the word was. The second hint came when he saw, with his own newborn eyes, a servant light a fire without flint or spark, just a flick of the wrist and a small burst of flame from nowhere at all. Magic was real here. That single realization changed everything about how Arthur planned to spend this second life. He couldn't walk yet, he could barely speak, but he could listen, and he could think, and while the rest of the household treated him like an ordinary infant, Arthur began quietly absorbing everything anyone said within earshot. By the time he was old enough to reach a bookshelf, he was already pulling books down and working through them alone, piecing together a picture of the world nobody had bothered explaining to a toddler. He learned the world was split into 3 kingdoms, each with its own history and its own rivalries. He learned that mana ran through nearly everyone in different amounts, and that some people were born with a gift for shaping it, while others could barely touch it at all. He learned about mana cores, about the different types of mages, about how bloodline and birth could decide how strong someone might eventually become. None of it felt entirely foreign. In his old life, he had trained in something called ki, a different discipline built on similar bones: breath, focus, the slow cultivation of inner strength. Mana wasn't ki, but it wasn't a stranger either, so he did what he had always done. He started training. Meditation came first, in stolen moments when nobody was watching a supposedly ordinary toddler sit unnaturally still in the corner of his room. He reached for the mana in the air around him, the way he used to reach for ki, patient and deliberate, gathering what he could and holding it, piece by piece, inside himself. Progress was slow. He didn't care. He had built an empire once out of patience alone. Every day added a little more. Every night he fell asleep a fraction closer to a goal none of the adults in his life knew he was even chasing. Children were not supposed to form a mana core this early. Everyone knew that. It was simply accepted. The way people accept that a seed takes a season to grow. Arthur had never been especially interested in accepted wisdom. Years compressed into habit. He trained in secret every single day, gathering stray fragments of mana, the way a careful hoarder collects coins, refusing to waste a single scrap. And then, on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, something inside him finally clicked into place. The mana core formed all at once, and the release that followed was not gentle. The explosion tore through the house before anyone could react. Walls buckled, furniture splintered. Alice screamed her son's name from somewhere outside, certain in that instant that she had lost him. When the dust cleared and Reynolds forced his way through the wreckage of what used to be their home, he found Arthur floating calmly in the center of the destruction, completely unharmed, mana still crackling faintly around him like static after a storm. His parents stared at him like he was a miracle and a mystery at the same time. Arthur, for his part, was mostly annoyed that he'd have to explain this eventually. He didn't, not fully. Children ask fewer questions than adults expect, and toddlers who accomplish impossible things are usually just praised, not interrogated. Life moved forward. 5 years slipped by in the ordinary rhythm of a family raising a gifted, strange, quietly determined little boy. Reynolds took charge of sword training, starting Arthur on the basics with the patient stubbornness of a father who wanted his son prepared for a dangerous world. Alice taught him to read and write, delighted and faintly unnerved by how quickly he absorbed it. And in whatever hours were left, Arthur kept building on his own foundation, working through the ranking system that measured a mage's strength, pushing his understanding further than anyone his age should have been able to reach. His parents eventually agreed he needed a real teacher, someone in the city of Xyrus who could guide a talent like his properly. What started as a plan to send Arthur off with an escort turned, after some discussion, into something else entirely. Neither Alice nor Reynolds wanted to be apart from him for that long. They decided the whole family would travel together. It should have been a simple trip. It did not stay simple for long. An adventurer party was hired to guard them on the road, 5 strangers who would end up meaning more to Arthur than any of them expected going in. There was Crunch, broad-shouldered and confident, the kind of fighter who sized up everyone he met out of habit. There was Angela, steady and watchful, Duran, quick and alert, Jasmine, sharp-eyed and curious, and Helen, whose easy warmth made the long stretches of travel feel less like a chore. They expected to be escorting an ordinary noble family with an ordinary child. Arthur's manners threw that assumption off within the first day. He spoke like someone twice his age, carried himself with a calm the adventurers found faintly unsettling in a boy his size, and answered questions with a thoughtfulness none of them were prepared for. Crunch noticed it first, and Crunch was not the type to let curiosity sit unspoken. He challenged Arthur to a spar one evening, half as a joke, expecting to humor a clever kid for a few minutes before getting back to camp business. Arthur agreed without hesitation. What followed wiped the humor off Crunch's face fast. Arthur fought using instincts and techniques that belonged to a man who had commanded soldiers, not a child who had barely finished sword basics with his own father. He read Crunch's movements, adjusted mid-exchange, and landed strikes that caught a seasoned adventurer completely off guard. His small body eventually betrayed him. He simply didn't have the strength or reach to finish what his technique had set up, and Crunch won in the end. But nobody around that fire treated it like a real victory. The whole group wanted to know where a child had learned to move like that. Arthur gave them a partial answer, sharing a few of the techniques openly, careful about how much he revealed. Jasmine picked them up faster than anyone expected, practicing the footwork by firelight, until Helen finally told her to sit down and eat. For a few days, the road felt almost peaceful. Then the bandits came. They didn't announce themselves the way lesser threats might have. One moment the caravan was moving through a quiet stretch of forest, and the next, armed men were closing in from every direction, cutting off retreat before anyone had fully registered the ambush. Their leader made his intentions clear fast. He wasn't interested in killing everyone. Women and children were worth more alive, sold rather than slaughtered, and he said as much with the casual cruelty of a man who had done this many times before. The fight that followed was nothing like sparring by a campfire. The adventurers threw themselves into the battle, Crunch and Angela holding the front line while Darren and Jasmine covered the flanks. But the bandits had numbers, and the kind of desperation that made men fight past reason. Reynolds fought beside them, sword drawn, trying to carve a path away from the worst of it, and it was the bandit leader himself who finally cut him down. Reynolds went to the ground bleeding badly, and for one terrible second, Alice's screaming filled the clearing louder than the clash of steel around them. She was pregnant, she was terrified, and in that moment she wasn't thinking about escape, she was thinking about her husband bleeding out in front of her. Reynolds, even wounded, still had enough left in him to give one final order. He told Arthur to protect Alice and get her out, whatever it took. He didn't ask if Arthur could handle it, he didn't have time to ask. Arthur promised him he would. He promised to protect his mother, and he promised to protect the sibling she hadn't even given birth to yet, a sibling he had never met, and one he suddenly, fiercely, did not intend to lose before he got the chance. Reynolds and Arthur's mother would end up safe from that battle, though the full details of how would only become clear much later. Right now, safety was still a promise, not a fact, and the fighting was far from finished. Arthur pulled Alice back through the chaos, scanning the tree line the way he'd been trained to scan a battlefield in another life. Something felt wrong. The bandits' formation had gaps that didn't make sense for a simple ambush, spacing that suggested more coordination than a random band of raiders should have had. Then he saw it, a fourth mage, positioned well outside the main fight, hidden where none of the adventurers had thought to look, already channeling a spell far too large for a routine bandit raid. There was no time to warn anyone properly. The mage's attack was already forming, a swelling mass of mana aimed squarely at the spot where Alice stood frozen with fear. Arthur didn't think. He moved. He shoved his mother out of the blast's path with everything his small body could manage, throwing her clear just as the attack tore through the space she'd occupied a half-second earlier. In the same motion, he flung a dagger laced with his own mana toward the hidden mage, striking true, catching the man off guard enough to disrupt his footing at the edge of the cliff behind him. It wasn't enough to stop the spell entirely. The attack caught Arthur instead of Alice, the full force of it slamming into him and sending him over the cliff's edge, tangled together with the mage he'd just struck down. Duran was already running, already screaming his name, closing the distance as fast as his legs could carry him. He wasn't fast enough. Arthur fell, the world spinning past him in a blur of stone and sky. And in that last stretch of falling silence, his thoughts weren't about the pain, or the mage tumbling beside him, or even his own life slipping away for a second time. He thought about the sibling he'd promised to protect. He thought that he might die without ever meeting them, without ever becoming the older brother he'd sworn, only moments earlier, that he would be. It would have been easy, in that last stretch of falling, to think back on everything King Grey had achieved, the wars won, the crown worn, the legacy built. Instead, his mind went somewhere quieter, back to the end of that first life, to a truth he'd spent years avoiding. Grey had stepped down from the throne eventually, worn out by decades of ruling, and in the stillness that followed his resignation, he'd finally had time to notice what his life had actually contained. Victories, yes. Titles, certainly. But almost no one who had stayed close to him simply because they wanted to, rather than because his crown demanded it. His greatest regret hadn't been a battle lost or a decision he'd made poorly. It had been arriving at the end of an extraordinary life and realizing how few people would genuinely mourn the man underneath the title. That was why this second chance had mattered so much from the very beginning. That was why Alice's warmth and Reynolds' steady trust had settled into him so deeply, so fast. He had spent one entire lifetime achieving everything except closeness, and he wasn't willing to lose the one thing he'd finally found, which made the fall hurt in a way physical pain alone never could have. Arthur woke to pain and the smell of blood that wasn't entirely his own. He lay at the base of the cliff for a long moment before he trusted his body enough to move, taking stock the way any experienced soldier would after a fall that should have killed him. Bruised, battered, alive. A few feet away, the mage who had nearly ended his mother's life lay motionless, the fall having finished what Arthur's dagger started. Small mercies. He allowed himself exactly one breath of relief before forcing himself upright. There was no food in his pockets, no supplies, nothing but the clothes on his back and whatever scraps the dead mage happened to be carrying. Arthur searched him without much ceremony, found some dried rations, and ate without appetite, purely because a body running on empty wouldn't get him anywhere. Then he started walking, with no clear direction and no idea how far he was from the road, from his parents, from anything resembling safety. That was when the voice found him. It came from somewhere close, and yet nowhere he could immediately place. Low and calm, cutting through the forest, quiet like it belonged there. Female, unhurried, and entirely too aware of exactly where he was standing. Arthur froze, every instinct from his old life screaming that something was watching him that he couldn't see. The voice told him not to panic. It told him it had already saved his life once tonight, catching him partway through that fall and softening what should have been a killing drop into something merely brutal. It told him to follow the sound if he wanted to live long enough to see his family again. He weighed his options for exactly as long as it took to remember he didn't have many. Wounded, alone, and lost in unfamiliar woods, with a voice offering the only lead toward getting home. Arthur followed it. The path wound deeper into rock and shadow than he expected, eventually opening into a cave mouth half hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines. Arthur hesitated at the entrance. Something about the air inside felt heavier, charged, the way a room feels right before a storm breaks. He stepped through anyway, because turning back wasn't really a choice at that point. What waited inside was not a person. The shape in the darkness was enormous, coiled against the cave wall, scales catching what little light filtered down from cracks in the stone above. Arthur's whole body locked up. Every survival instinct he had, from both lives combined, told him he was standing in front of something that could kill him without even trying. The creature shifted, and pain flickered visibly across her massive frame. Whatever she was hurt badly enough that even moving cost her something. She told him her name was Sylvia, her voice carrying none of the menace her size suggested. She explained, patiently, that she was hiding, wounded, hunted by enemies she didn't elaborate on yet, tucked away in this cave to recover from injuries that weren't healing the way they should have been. She'd sensed the battle happening above, sensed a small mana signature falling through the air towards certain death, and something about the boy throwing himself in front of danger for someone else had made her act before she'd fully decided to. She admitted, almost reluctantly, that loneliness had played a part in that decision too. Arthur didn't trust her right away. Trust wasn't something he handed out easily, not after a life spent surrounded by people who wanted things from him. But Sylvia made no demands, asked for nothing in return, and over the following days, wary distance slowly gave ground to something warmer. She explained she could open a dimensional portal, something capable of sending him home, but not yet, not while she was this weak. It would take time to recover enough strength to attempt it safely, and Arthur, with nowhere else to go and no way to travel the distance on his own, settled in to wait. Months passed in that cave, and what started as a temporary arrangement became something neither of them had expected. Sylvia taught him. Real techniques, layered deeper than anything he'd pieced together alone from stolen books, mana rotation that let energy circulate through the body instead of sitting stagnant, methods for absorbing ambient mana even while moving instead of only during stillness, meditation techniques far more advanced than anything a self-taught toddler could have stumbled onto by accident. The mana rotation technique nearly broke him before he mastered it. Arthur spent long hours failing at it, losing focus, starting over, failing again, the frustration mounting each time his concentration slipped at the worst possible moment. Sylvia never once suggested he stop. She just waited, correcting his form, letting him fail as many times as he needed to. Eventually, gradually, the failures thinned out, and what had felt impossible became merely difficult, then finally familiar. Between the lessons, something else was growing. Arthur found himself talking to her the way he hadn't talked to anyone in either lifetime, about his parents, about the fall, about the anger sitting in his chest like a coal that wouldn't cool down. He told her, one evening, exactly how much he hated the bandits who'd hurt Reynolds and nearly taken Alice. Sylvia listened without judgment, and when he finished, she told him something he hadn't expected to hear, from a dragon hiding in a cave. She said revenge made a poor foundation for a life. That hatred, left unchecked, had a way of consuming far more than it ever satisfied, and that a boy who'd already been given a second chance owed it to himself not to waste it staring backward. She didn't tell him to forgive anyone. She told him to keep walking forward, instead of letting old wounds decide where he went next. Arthur didn't answer right away. He sat with it instead, turning her words over for days afterward, in a way he suspected she'd intended all along. It was during one of their quieter evenings that he noticed something was wrong. Sylvia's wounds, which should have been closing by now, weren't. If anything, they looked worse than when he'd first stumbled into that cave, and Arthur, sharper about these things than most children his age had any right to be, put the pieces together with a sick, sinking certainty. The portal she'd been preparing wasn't just difficult to create, it was killing her, slowly, every time she worked on it. He confronted her about it, and Sylvia, cornered, finally told him the truth she'd been holding back. She wasn't simply some powerful, wounded creature hiding in the dark. She was a dragon, an old, immensely powerful one, far beyond anything Arthur had encountered in either of his lives, and the enemies hunting her weren't the kind that gave up easily. She'd known, this whole time, that finishing the portal would cost her dearly. She'd done it anyway. She pressed something into his hands before he could argue. An egg, strange and faintly warm, its shell catching light in colors that shouldn't have belonged to any ordinary creature. Feathers followed, delicate and clearly not meant for any bird he recognized. And then something else, something she wouldn't fully explain, only calling it a gift meant for later. Before Arthur could demand answers, the ground outside the cave trembled. Whatever had been hunting Sylvia had finally found her. She moved fast for someone so wounded, mana flooding the cave in a wave that froze the moment around them, time itself bending strangely at the edges, giving them one borrowed stretch of stillness that didn't belong to the world outside. In that suspended quiet, she asked him for one thing. She asked him to call her grandma. Just once, before he left. Arthur's voice cracked when he said it, the word landing heavier than he expected, carrying weight he hadn't realized he'd built up over months of quiet mornings, and patient lessons, and a companionship he hadn't been looking for, but couldn't imagine going without now. Sylvia's expression, as much as a dragon's face could show emotion, softened at hearing it. Then she pushed him through the portal, and the cave, and Sylvia, and the trembling ground outside were gone. Arthur landed hard on unfamiliar grass, somewhere far from that cliff, far from the bandits, far from everything that had happened over the past several months. He lay there for a moment, catching his breath, before a voice reached him again. Not live this time, but recorded. Sylvia's tone carrying through some final piece of magic she'd left behind specifically for this moment. She told him she'd left him more than the egg and the feathers. She'd left him a will, a legacy tied to her, one that would only make sense once he reached a certain threshold of strength she called the white core. Until then, some truths would have to stay buried. Then she told him something that stopped his breathing entirely. She'd known, the whole time, exactly who he'd been before this life. She'd known he was once King Grey, long before he'd ever said a word about it. Arthur sat frozen in that field for a long time after the message ended, turning the revelation over and over, questions multiplying faster than he could organize them. How had she known? How long had she known? What else did she know that she'd chosen not to say? None of the answers were coming, not yet, not from an empty field, with nothing left of her but an egg and a promise of truths waiting somewhere beyond a strength he hadn't reached. He thought again about her advice, about revenge, about moving forward instead of living inside old wounds. Sylvia was gone now, and the urge to chase down whoever had been hunting her burned hot and immediate. He let it burn, and then, deliberately, he chose not to follow it. He got back on his feet instead, and he started walking. The road ahead of him eventually led him somewhere he hadn't planned on. The edge of a rougher path where slave traders had set up camp, dragging along a cargo they had no business calling cargo at all. A young elf girl sat bound among them, small and terrified, clearly worth more to these men as merchandise than as a person. Arthur watched from cover for a long while before he moved. He didn't rush in. He picked his moments the way a soldier would, isolating the traders one at a time, using the dark and the terrain, and every trick Sylvia had spent months drilling into him. The first trader never saw him coming. Neither did the second. By the time the last two realized something was wrong, it was already far too late for either of them to do anything about it. 4 traders down. One frightened elf child left staring at the boy who'd just killed everyone holding her captive. Arthur cut her free, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The elf girl didn't move for a long moment, staring at the ropes still hanging loose around her wrists like she couldn't quite believe they weren't holding her anymore. Arthur crouched down to her level, careful not to make any sudden movements, and told her she was safe now. It took her a while to believe him. Her name, she finally offered, was Tessia. She said it quietly, testing whether he'd react to it the way some humans did to elf names, and relaxed slightly when he only nodded and asked if she was hurt anywhere. Arthur had planned on heading straight home after Sylvia's portal dropped him wherever it dropped him. That plan hadn't survived contact with 4 dead slave traders and 1 very frightened child with nowhere else to go. He gathered what supplies the traders had left behind: food, a bedroll, a water skin that had seen better days, and told Tessia he'd get her back to her people before worrying about anything else. She didn't argue. She didn't have the strength left to argue about anything. The forest around them was thick and old, the kind of woodland that swallowed sound and light in equal measure, and their journey through it fell into an easy, uneven rhythm over the following days. Tessia stayed quiet at first, flinching at noises that weren't threats, watching Arthur with the wary attention of someone waiting to find out what he actually wanted from her. He didn't want anything. That seemed to confuse her more than anything else about him. Slowly, carefully, conversation crept in around the edges of their travel. Tessia asked him questions about where he'd learned to fight like that, and Arthur gave her partial answers the same way he'd given the adventurers partial answers, keeping the deepest parts of his story tucked away. She talked, in turn, about her home, about a family she was desperate to get back to, about small details of elf life that Arthur found himself genuinely curious about despite everything else weighing on his mind. There was an easy humor to her once the fear started wearing off, a habit of teasing him about his overly formal way of speaking, pointing out that he sounded like someone's grandfather trapped in a child's body. Arthur didn't correct her on how close that observation actually landed. The friendship built itself in small pieces. She started walking closer to him instead of a cautious distance behind. She stopped flinching at every snapped twig in the underbrush. By the 3rd night around their small fire, she was falling asleep mid-sentence instead of staring at the tree line, watching for threats that weren't coming anymore. Arthur, for his part, kept quietly grateful for the distraction. It gave him something to focus on besides the ache Sylvia's absence had left behind, and besides the question that kept circling back no matter how hard he tried to push it aside. How she'd known about King Grey, and what else she'd chosen not to tell him. The pain started on the 4th day. It came without warning, a sharp pulse from somewhere deep in his mana core, gone almost as fast as it hit. Arthur brushed it off as leftover strain from the fall, from the fight with the traders, from months of pushing his body harder than a child's body was built to handle. It happened again the following morning, then again that evening, sharper this time, enough to make his breath catch mid-stride. He didn't mention it to Tessia. She had enough to worry about without adding his problems to the pile, and besides, he had no answers to offer even if he wanted to explain it. Whatever was happening inside him didn't match anything Sylvia had taught him about, and it definitely didn't match anything he remembered from his own careful study of mana cores back when he was still a toddler pulling books off shelves in secret. It came back a 3rd time as they crossed a shallow stream, hard enough that his knee buckled for half a step before he caught himself. Tessia noticed that time. She asked if he was all right, and Arthur told her he was fine, in a tone that clearly didn't convince either of them. Whatever was building inside his core, it wasn't finished yet. He could feel that much, even without understanding what it meant. The forest thinned slightly as the days passed, the terrain shifting toward something greener, older, the trees themselves growing taller and stranger the closer they got to wherever Tessia's homeland actually was. She grew quieter again as the journey stretched on, though it wasn't fear driving it this time. It looked more like homesickness, like the weight of everything she'd survived finally catching up with her now that safety was within reach instead of a distant hope. Arthur walked beside her without pushing her to talk. He understood, better than most, what it meant to carry something too heavy to put into words yet. Somewhere ahead, past the deepening green and the strange, ancient quiet settling over the woods, Tessia's people were waiting. Somewhere behind them, an egg and a set of feathers sat wrapped carefully in Arthur's pack, holding secrets Sylvia had promised would only make sense once he reached a strength he hadn't come close to yet. And somewhere inside his own chest, his mana core kept pulsing with a pain that had no explanation, growing sharper each time it struck. He didn't know yet what any of it meant. He only knew the road toward the elf kingdom was getting shorter with every step, and that whatever waited for him there, he wouldn't be walking into it as the same boy who'd been thrown off a cliff months earlier.